A reading from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed that, when it is sown in the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Without parables, he did not speak to them, but to his own disciples he explained everything in private.
The parable of the mustard seed is perhaps the most misunderstood of Jesus' parables. In my experience, the people who absolutely love this quote-unquote simple parable usually are reading it out of context, causing them to read it incorrectly. However, when they learn of its original first-century context, they get really confused because this parable isn't simple at all. Rather, it's actually quite difficult and counterintuitive. Yet that's exactly what Jesus wants, because he wants them to leave with more questions than answers. Not so much about mustard, of course, but about the kingdom of God. Before we take a look at this parable in more detail, we need to understand what the word kingdom meant in the first century. When someone said the word kingdom, it meant the Roman kingdom. So when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, that's a subtle dig at the abuses of the Roman Empire. In other words, if God were running the kingdom, then it wouldn't look at all like the Roman Empire. Furthermore, you could probably replace the word the Roman kingdom with the Jewish hierarchy, since they worked with Rome and would therefore be at odds with the kingdom of God as well. So whenever we see the words kingdom of God, we always need to remember how subversive and controversial it is on its own merit. Having said this, let's get back into the parable. First, if we read this parable without context, then it sounds quite pleasing and easy to understand. According to Jesus, the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds in the kingdom, but when it's fully grown, it becomes a large bush. On its own, it doesn't sound revolutionary at all, and really doesn't cause anyone to leave with more questions than answers. So what if we understand this story in context of the first century world where Jesus lived? When Jews of the first century thought about what the kingdom of God was like, they usually thought of it on a massive scale. Specifically, one of the more popular images for the kingdom was the mighty cedar of Lebanon, which was an extremely massive and tall tree. If that were what Jesus said the kingdom was like, that wouldn't cause much of a reaction other than, duh, everybody knows that. Yet Jesus says something quite the opposite of a mighty cedar, in favor of a tiny mustard seed which grows into a large mustard tree. But there's no such thing as a mustard tree. So why would Jesus say such a thing? Clearly, Jesus knows that everyone sees the kingdom in light of a massive tree like the cedar of Lebanon. So he challenges their preconceived notions by saying the kingdom isn't like the mighty cedar of Lebanon, in favor of a mustard tree. He's taking a traditional image of the kingdom and almost making a satire out of it. But when you understand a little bit more about the role of mustard in the first century, it gets even more challenging to the point where it almost might sound offensive. Although we probably think of mustard as a condiment that complements our hamburgers and hot dogs, for the people of the first century, it was nowhere close to that. In fact, mustard seeds proved to be more of a nuisance to them because it invaded all of their crops and needed to be controlled. For those of us who enjoy gardening, we probably understand what this means, since weeds get into our garden all the time and need to be contained. As a result, to the first century Jews, mustard was the equivalent of a weed that got in the way of their crops. So when Jesus says the kingdom is like a mustard seed, he is implicitly saying that the kingdom isn't like a mighty cedar tree, but rather is a giant weed tree. So the use of the word tree rather than bush is very calculated and strategic. And it should quite rightly get people to leave with more questions than answers. To further illustrate this point, theologian John Dominic Crossan creates an imaginary dialogue from those who listen to this parable. What's it like? You mean the kingdom is big, but you just said that it's a big weed. So why don't you say a big cedar of Lebanon? Why a big weed? And besides, this mustard, we're not certain we like this mustard. It's very dangerous in our fields. We try to control it. We try to contain it. Why do you mean the kingdom is something that the people try to control and contain? Every reaction in the audience fighting with themselves, as it were, answering back to Jesus, is doing exactly what he wants. It's making them think not about mustard, of course, but about the kingdom. But the trap is that this is a very provocative, even weird image for the kingdom. To say the kingdom is like a cedar of Lebanon, everyone would yawn, say, of course. It's like a mustard seed? What's going on here? That's a very great question that Crossan puts here. What is going on here? What in the world does Jesus mean? He certainly isn't talking about how a tiny mustard seed grows into a massive mustard bush or tree. That's not the main point he's trying to make. Rather, he's getting people to understand that the kingdom of God is very different than what we expect it to be. Applying this parable to its original context, we might be able to see a correlation between the massive and powerful cedar of Lebanon to the lowly mustard weed tree. And we can maybe see a metaphor of the cedar as being the rich and powerful to the mustard tree as being the poor and outcasts of society. As we all know, the kingdom of God does not bless the rich, but exalts the poor. God's kingdom does not bless Caesar in the Roman Empire, but it exalts those who the Romans marginalized and persecuted on a daily basis. In today's world, we clearly see how the gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The kingdom of God, in other words, is for the weeds of the world, not the powerful and mighty cedars. So the parable of the mustard seed isn't really about how it starts so small and grows into a great size, but it's more about challenging the domination system of his day. And by extension, it can be applied to today's domination system, which favors the wealthy over the poor. Although today's system might say, blessed are the rich, our God says, blessed are the poor. It's a very subtle and subversive way of getting people to see the world in a different way. It also points out how the wealthy use their power to contain and control the weeds of society. Is this the way the kingdom would run if God were in charge? Absolutely not.